The London airport was bustling that morning as always. Passengers hurried through the brightly lit corridors, dragging suitcases, talking on their phones, holding coffee cups. Among them, a man walked calmly, dressed in a simple hoodie and sports pants. His hood was slightly raised, hiding part of his face, and he carried only a medium-sized backpack on his back. Mohamed Salah was used to situations like this. Despite being one of the most famous football players in the world, he liked to keep a low profile when he wasn't on the pitch. He wasn't the type to show off with flashy clothes or extravagant jewelry. He preferred simplicity and, above all, valued his privacy. He went through the usual procedures without any issues. His first-class ticket was scanned at the boarding gate, and the attendant smiled at him, wishing him a pleasant flight. Salah nodded in return and proceeded down the corridor leading to the plane. Upon entering the aircraft, he noticed the luxurious environment of the first-class cabin. Wide, reclining seats, individual screens, exclusive onboard service. It was a long flight, and that comfort made all the difference. He walked to his seat, placed his backpack in the overhead compartment, and settled in. He took out his phone and began responding to some messages. A few minutes later, other passengers started boarding. A flight attendant passed by, offering warm towels and welcome drinks. Salah accepted a glass of orange juice, thanking her politely. Everything seemed normal, just like every other time he traveled. However, before the plane even took off, something unusual happened. A tall man, dressed in a pilot's uniform, entered the first-class cabin with a stern expression. He looked around as if searching for someone. His name was Richard Cole, and he was the captain of that flight. When he spotted Salah sitting comfortably in one of the premium seats, Richard frowned. His mind, filled with prejudice, immediately jumped to conclusions. To him, this man didn't look like someone who could afford a first-class seat. He was dressed too simply with no visible signs of wealth. Moreover, there was something about his appearance that unsettled Richard in a way he couldn't quite explain, or perhaps simply refused to admit. The pilot walked up to Salah, stopping beside his seat. The player looked up from his phone, surprised by the captain's presence. "Excuse me, sir," Richard said in a cold, distant tone. "I believe you are in the wrong seat." Salah blinked, not understanding. "Sorry." "This seat," the pilot insisted, crossing his arms. "It's in the first-class section. Only passengers with the proper ticket can sit here." Salah frowned, now grasping the situation. "I know," he replied, remaining calm. "My ticket is first class." The pilot narrowed his eyes, examining Salah from head to toe. He didn't seem convinced. "May I see your ticket?" Salah nodded, already feeling the discomfort rising. He took out his phone and opened the digital boarding pass, showing the QR code and flight details. The pilot glanced at the screen but made no effort to hide his skepticism. "And how did you get this ticket?" he asked, his tone almost accusatory. The player now felt the eyes of other passengers on him. Some seemed curious, others visibly annoyed by the scene. Salah took a deep breath, trying to stay patient. "I bought it," he answered simply. The pilot let out a short, dry laugh. "You bought it?" "Yes, like any other passenger." Richard crossed his arms and looked around as if expecting someone to confirm his suspicion. The silence that followed was uncomfortable. The flight attendant nearby looked nervous but hesitant to intervene. "Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said, trying to defuse the situation. "A misunderstanding?" Richard turned to her with a raised eyebrow. "Or is someone here trying to take advantage of something?" Salah felt a wave of irritation rising inside him, but he kept his composure. This wasn't the first time he had faced a situation like this, and unfortunately, he knew it wouldn't be the last. "If there's any issue, I can speak with the responsible staff," he said. "But I'm sure my ticket is correct." The pilot shook his head. "This doesn't seem right," he murmured, as if talking to himself. Then he raised his voice again. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave the first-class section." Now everyone was watching. Some passengers whispered among themselves. Salah looked directly into the pilot's eyes and, for a brief moment, thought about confronting him right there, but he knew that would only create more trouble. "I don't think we have anything more to discuss," he said, his voice firm but controlled. The pilot narrowed his eyes. "Then I'll call security." The tension in the air was palpable. Salah looked at the flight attendant, who seemed embarrassed by the situation. Then, he took a deep breath, trying to decide what his next move would be. The silence in the first-class cabin was almost deafening. All eyes were on Salah and the pilot, who remained standing beside him, waiting for him to simply get up and obey the absurd order. The flight attendant still looked nervous but hesitated to intervene directly. Salah took a deep breath. He had experienced uncomfortable situations before, especially because of his background and appearance. Despite his fame, he knew that for some people, that didn't mean anything. They only saw what they wanted to see. "I already told you that my ticket is correct," Salah replied, keeping his tone controlled but now firmer. "If there's any doubt, I suggest you check the system." The pilot, Richard Cole, gave a cynical smile. "I don't need to check anything. I am the captain of this flight, and I'm telling you that you can't stay here." Passengers began murmuring among themselves. Some looked uncomfortable, others just curious. A man sitting a few rows ahead, wearing an expensive suit, cleared his throat and raised his voice. "If his ticket is legitimate, what's the problem?" Richard looked at the man with visible irritation, but didn't answer. Instead, he turned to the flight attendant and said, "Call security." The young woman hesitated. "Captain, maybe we should check the system first just to be sure." The pilot stared at her, his eyes filled with impatience. "I gave an order." The flight attendant bit her lip, clearly uncomfortable, but nodded and quickly left the cabin. Salah observed everything in silence, feeling the anger rising inside him. He knew that if he lost his temper, he would be giving the pilot exactly what he wanted: a reason to remove him under the pretext of inappropriate behavior. He pulled out his phone and reopened his digital boarding pass. "It's right here," he said, showing the QR code and the registered seat once again. "You can simply scan it and confirm." Richard let out a short laugh. "I don't need to scan anything. Do you really think you can hide behind a digital piece of paper?" The comment made Salah frown. "Hide? What are you talking about?" The pilot leaned in slightly, his voice low but dripping with venom. "I know people like you, always trying to sneak into places where they don't belong." Salah's jaw tightened. He was used to ignoring provocations both on and off the field, but this was different. He was being humiliated in public for no reason. A few minutes later, a security officer appeared in the cabin. He was a tall, strong man dressed in the airline's uniform. He looked at the pilot with a respectful nod, and then at Salah. "What seems to be the problem here?" Richard crossed his arms. "This passenger is occupying a seat that he clearly has no right to. I asked him to leave, but he refuses to comply." The officer looked at Salah, then at the pilot. His expression revealed nothing, but his posture indicated that he was there to resolve the situation quickly. Salah remained calm. "My ticket is for first class. I bought it like any other passenger here. If you want to confirm, you can scan the code." The officer glanced at Richard, who scoffed impatiently. "I already told you that's unnecessary. I just want him out." The officer hesitated. He looked at the flight attendant standing nearby, who was clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation. "Have you checked his ticket?" The young woman opened her mouth to answer, but Richard was quicker. "That's not necessary. This is my plane, and I make the decisions." The security officer took a deep breath. He was there to follow orders, but he also knew he couldn't just remove a passenger without cause. He turned to Salah. "Sir, may I see your ticket?" Before Salah could react, Richard interrupted again. "I already told you he doesn't belong here. Are you going to help me or not?" Now, the murmurs among the passengers grew louder. Some people started recording with their phones. A couple sitting on the other side of the cabin exchanged glances, and then the woman spoke up loudly. "I know who he is." "Do you know who he is?" The pilot turned to her, irritated. "What does that have to do with anything?" It has everything to do with it, the woman continued, because he's probably the most important person on this plane. Richard scoffed. Oh, please. The man next to her nodded. He's Mohamed Salah, one of the greatest football players in the world. If he wanted to, he could probably buy this whole plane. Richard was silent for a moment. He seemed to process the information but refused to admit he was wrong. The security officer looked at Salah again, this time with a glimmer of recognition in his eyes. Then, discreetly, he pulled out a portable scanner and scanned Salah's QR code. The screen confirmed, first class, correct seat. The officer took a deep breath and turned to the pilot. His ticket is legitimate. He has the right to this seat. Richard clenched his jaw, clearly furious. I don't give a damn what that scanner says. He's not staying here. The commotion in the cabin escalated. Now several passengers were recording. Some were already arguing amongst themselves about the pilot's behavior. Salah finally leaned forward, looking directly at Richard. You want me to leave? He asked, his voice low but intense. The pilot held his gaze. Yes. Then do it officially. Announce over the intercom that you're removing a passenger with a legitimate ticket because you simply don't like his presence. Richard didn't respond. He knew that if he did that, he would be putting himself in a difficult position. The situation was slipping out of his control, and he realized this could become a major problem for the airline. The security officer realized this too. Captain, I suggest we resolve this differently. The pilot gritted his teeth, feeling cornered. He knew that the best option was to back down, but his anger and pride wouldn't let him. Salah crossed his arms and waited. He knew this man had no way out now. The silence in the first-class cabin was heavy. All eyes were on the pilot, Richard Cole, who now seemed torn between his anger and the realization that he had completely lost control of the situation. The security officer remained next to Salah, maintaining a neutral stance but now fully aware that the problem wasn't the passenger. It was the captain himself. By now, multiple passengers had their phones out, recording the entire scene. Some whispered among themselves, outraged, while others simply watched, waiting to see how far this would go. Salah remained silent, calm, but his gaze was locked onto the pilot's, challenging him without needing to say a word. Richard, feeling increasingly cornered, looked around, noticing the cameras and the expectant faces. His pride wouldn't let him simply back down, but he knew he had to find a way out without looking completely defeated. Then, he did something no one expected. He took a step back and let out a short, sarcastic laugh. Very well, Mr. Salah, it looks like you've won your little spectacle, he said, his tone bitter. But I am still the captain of this flight. Before anyone could react, Richard turned sharply on his heels and walked briskly out of the first-class cabin. Salah frowned, sensing that something wasn't right. The security officer also seemed suspicious. And then it happened. Richard's voice echoed through the aircraft's speakers. Attention, passengers. This flight has been canceled due to operational reasons. All passengers must disembark immediately. Shock rippled through the cabin. A murmur spread across the plane, followed by protests. Passengers looked at each other, incredulous. Salah felt his stomach turn. He knew this had nothing to do with operational reasons. It was pure revenge. The flight attendant covered her mouth, stunned. The security officer immediately grabbed his radio, speaking in a low but urgent tone. Richard had made the extreme decision to cancel the entire flight, inconveniencing hundreds of passengers, just to avoid admitting he was wrong. The speakers crackled again, and Richard's voice returned. The airline will arrange accommodations and new flights for all passengers. We apologize for the inconvenience. Chaos erupted in the cabin. People started standing up, questioning the flight attendants. Some shouted in frustration, others hurried to their phones to rebook flights. Salah remained seated for a few seconds, processing what had just happened. Then, he slowly got up, grabbed his backpack from the overhead compartment, and started walking down the aisle. He could feel the eyes of many passengers on him. Some were just curious, others showed clear sympathy. As he stepped out of the first-class cabin, He saw Richard standing outside the aircraft, speaking with some airline staff members. The pilot still had a cold, closed expression, but his posture was noticeably tense. The security officer who had witnessed everything walked alongside Salah as they headed toward the terminal. "I've never seen anything like that before," the officer murmured. He'd rather cancel an entire flight than admit he was wrong. Salah sighed. Some people just can't stand losing. When they reached the airport terminal, Salah realized the fallout had already begun. Angry passengers were posting videos on social media, and journalists stationed at the airport started noticing the commotion. Within minutes, the story exploded online. Pilot cancels entire flight to remove Mohamed Salah from first class. Videos circulated rapidly. The pilot's name, Richard Cole, was already trending worldwide. People from all over the world reacted with outrage, demanding explanations from the airline. Salah's fans and football enthusiasts quickly came to his defense, while the company had no choice but to act swiftly. Inside the airport, Salah stayed away from the growing media storm. He had already messaged his agent and his team was handling the situation. A short while later, a visibly nervous airline representative approached him. "Mr. Salah, we would like to sincerely apologize for what happened. Captain Cole has been immediately suspended, and we are taking steps to ensure something like this never happens again." Salah simply nodded, uninterested in empty apologies. "Just get me on my flight," he said, tired of the whole situation. A few hours later, Salah boarded a new aircraft, this time without any issues. The next day, the airline released an official statement announcing the termination of Richard Cole. The public pressure had been immense, and the company had no choice but to formally apologize to Salah and all affected passengers. As for Richard, he disappeared from the public eye. His name became synonymous with arrogance and prejudice, and his career ended in disgrace. Salah moved on with his life, unaffected by the incident. He knew the world was still full of people like Richard, but he also knew that his presence, his voice, and his actions could inspire change. And in the end, the best response he could give was to keep shining on the pitch,